I'm Haley B. Miller, and this is Ohio Politics Explained, a podcast where you give us 15 minutes and we give you all the news you need to sound smart and impress your friends. Welcome to another episode of Ohio Politics Explained, the primary election edition. On May 5th, voters will choose their nominees for governor, U.S. Senate, and several other statewide races, in addition to primaries for congressional and legislative seats. We'll take you through some of the marquee races and how they'll set the stage for this fall. Jesse Balmert is here today to help me break it all down.
Happy pre-election day.
As you all know, the top of the ticket this year is the race for governor. There's no primary for the Democratic nomination, which belongs to Dr. Amy Acton. But Vivek Ramaswamy, the likely GOP nominee, is on the ballot with two long-shot candidates, and one of them isn't even a candidate anymore. What do we know about his opponents?
Yeah, I feel like the Republican primary for Ohio governor to replace Mike DeWine it really started in January of 2025 and has not stopped until this very moment. So it's been quite the roller coaster at various points. We had Ohio Attorney General Dave Yost was in the race. Jim Tressel, the current lieutenant governor, former Ohio State football coach, was considering getting in the race. So it's been a journey. But where we are heading into Election Day is Ramaswamy has one official primary challenger, which is Casey Putsch, who is a kind of car enthusiast. He invented a type of car and has really been going at Ramaswamy from the right and kind of leaning into the less savory aspects of this race. And then Heather Hill from Morgan County, a former school board member, was signed up to be in this race, but had a fight with her running mate, and the running mate got out of the race, which ended her campaign effectively.
I just learned when all this happened and find it crazy that your running mate can completely derail your campaign if they choose to.
Yeah, it's you want to choose that person pretty wisely. But Ohio election law basically says that if you make a change within 70 days of the election, unless the person has passed away, you can't do that and the votes don't count.
That's so interesting. And it's worth noting that Hill will still be on the ballot because all of this unfolded after early voting had started, but any votes for her and her running mate will not count, right?
That's how it's going to work.
So Hill and even Putsch are considered long shot candidates. Ramaswamy has really had this primary tied up from the beginning. But the results could forecast how he'll fare among Republicans in the November election. Is there anything you're going to be looking out for?
Yeah, I'm really interested, how much does Ramaswamy win this primary by? Does it show strength? Does it show he has a lot of grassroots support? Is he winning outside of the large cities and kind of all across the state? Those are the things you want to look for. A comparison that you can look at is in 2020, Governor Mike DeWine didn't get above 50% in the Republican primary. He had a couple of challengers, notably Joe Blystone, who was running a just kind of odd campaign, but still managed to get a decent chunk of the votes. And so is Casey in that kind of Joe Blystone role for this election? Or is it just going to be a runaway victory for Ramaswamy, who has a lot of advantages, including massive fundraising advantage?
And we never know how things are going to work out in any election, but it's entirely possible that even if there are folks who vote for Putsch or stay home who don't vote for Ramaswamy in the primary, in the DeWine race, for example, and in other elections like this, we often see, the Republicans eventually come home, even if their first choice on the primary ballot doesn't make it to the fall. Now, of course, like I said, anything can happen, but that is something that we've seen before.
Yeah. In 22, Mike DeWine, basically crushed his Democratic challenger, Nan Whaley. I think because this is an open seat, because you have two candidates who've never run for political office before, this is going to be certainly more competitive than that re-election bid in 2022. But yeah, the state has been trending Republican for the past several years. So that's certainly an advantage that Ramaswamy has. And it'll be interesting what kind of national headwinds from either the economy or the popularity of President Donald Trump either swing in his or Acton's favor.
Now, governor is not the only job on the ballot this year. All of Ohio's statewide officials are term limited, so their positions are up for grabs. And we have competitive primaries in the races for Secretary of State, Treasurer, Attorney General, and the Ohio Supreme Court. There's also a Democratic primary in the U.S. Senate race, but former Senator Sherrod Brown is heavily favored to win that one. I want to turn to the treasurer's race for a moment because it's just very interesting. Treasurer is a boring job if done correctly, but this primary is pretty heated. Give us the lay of the land.
Yeah, so what's interesting about this race is you don't have an incumbent. You don't have someone who's already been a statewide elected official who's just trying to kind of musical chairs their way into a different position. This is a truly open race. And so the two candidates are former state rep Jay Edwards and current state senator Christina Rogner, who are people who probably just don't have tremendous statewide name recognition. They were elected in their respective corners of the state, but people probably don't know them too well outside of that. So they've scored some pretty impressive endorsements. Jay Edwards is being endorsed by Vice President J.D. Vance and Ohio Senator Bernie Moreno. And then Rogner has the endorsement of Vivek Ramaswamy, the Republican, likely GOP nominee for governor, as well as the top Republican lawmakers at the state house. And so while these candidates themselves might not be well known, their backers certainly are.
Yeah, and it was honestly so crazy to me that Vance weighed in on a state treasurer race. Of course, Vance is an Ohio guy. He's very close to a lot of current and former elected officials in Ohio, but it's just not something you see every day, a vice president endorsing in a race like this. And on the flip side, we saw some recent polling from Bowling Green State University about the upcoming elections, and beyond the governor's race and to some degree the Senate race, voters have no idea who a lot of these candidates are.
Yeah, in this treasurer's race in particular, it could come down to just like who runs an ad that more people see, or maybe which person has a better ballot name. Certainly, Christina Rogner has pitched herself as the candidate with an MBA, so kind of the experience in the financial field, and also someone who's willing to work with state lawmakers, has a lot of support within the legislature, versus Jay Edwards has come out as more of a willing critic of the Republican legislature. He said that spending $600 million in unclaimed funds on the Cleveland Browns' new stadium was a mistake and like something he would not have done if he was in the state legislature. So it's just been a really interesting race all around for a seat that isn't particularly interesting intrinsically.
Yeah, for sure. Another race I know I'll be watching is Secretary of State. There are primaries on both sides of the aisle that each feature a current elected official and a political outsider. But the Democratic race seems a lot more competitive. Representative Allison Russo, who served as House Minority Leader, is facing Cincinnati Dr. Brian Hambly. For being new to campaigns, Hambly has gotten quite a bit of support, including from Senate Minority Leader Nikki Antonio. And he's been critical of Russo's past votes on redistricting.
Yeah, this is just a really fascinating race for a lot of reasons. Just like backing up for a second, I think Secretary of State is such an important down-ticket race, in part because it runs elections, but also this person has a seat on the Ohio Redistricting Commission, so that determines where the congressional lines are drawn, or can determine where the congressional lines are drawn and the state legislative lines. They're also an important vote on the Ohio ballot board, which sets the language for things that you might vote on as far as constitutional amendments. So it's a pretty powerful position, which is probably why we have such a race on both sides here. But yeah, definitely Democrats have been critical of Allison Russo's accepting of these maps, which were drawn by the Republicans. Certainly the counterpoint that she puts forward is they would have gotten worse maps if they hadn't gone along. It's hard to negotiate in the super minority.
Yeah, for sure. And again, with this being a little bit lesser profile of a race, it's hard to say how much voters are paying attention, if they're really plugged into things like how Russo voted on congressional maps a few years ago, but definitely an interesting dynamic. There's a similar vibe on the Republican side. You have Treasurer Robert Sprague running against Marcel Stripsch. He's a former Air Force officer. He's really leaning into that kind of political outsider brand and because of that, we're seeing, I think, Sprague maybe tout some positions that even current Secretary of State Frank LaRose doesn't necessarily support. Sprague has been critical of mail-in voting, as has his opponent, but it's an interesting posture for a Republican in Ohio to take when, you know, current GOP leadership is very fond of Ohio's election system.
Yeah, it's hard to say Ohio's voting is horrible and we need to throw it out when your party is running Ohio's voting system right now. But primaries are primaries, so I get why we are where we are. Another issue that's come up is ballot drop boxes, and Sprague came out with an ad that looked like Sesame Street and said we need to ditch these drop boxes, which there's one per county that are like heavily monitored and can only be opened by both Democrat and Republican. And so this is like an option for people who want to drop off their ballot or other kind of election registration paperwork and so forth. So you're seeing people come down on the party lines, which makes sense going into a primary.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, there is a lot we didn't get to today. For more information on Ohio's primary races and the candidates, be sure to check out the stories on our websites. Early voting continues through Sunday, and polls will be open on Election Day from 6:30 a.m. to 7:30 p.m. A big change for this election is if you vote absentee, your ballot has to arrive by the close of polls on Tuesday to be counted. So make sure you get those in the mail if you haven't already. If you have any other questions about how to vote, you can visit voteohio.gov, and we'll be back next week to dissect all the results.